Hey everyone, and welcome back to Shadowlands Alpha. So, Death Knight DPS, a powerhouse when it was introduced, played by just about everyone. They were these slow-moving juggernauts, nigh unkillable, these true harbingers of death. That is what Wrath players, right, will remember them as, going around Hellfire, just wiping everything out. But over the years, they've lost most of that through the loss of defensives and heightened mobility across other classes. They no longer feel like the Lich King did in the Halls of Reflection, right? This just inevitable advancing doom. And while Shadowlands' changes don't exactly solve this, the addition of more defensives and baseline tools will actually help Death Knights out a lot in terms of the field department. The DPS specs, which we'll talk about today, get some pretty nice upgrades. Sadly though, Frost still has some fundamental issues that just hold it back a little bit, but Unholy is really starting to shine. There's a lot to get into with this video. I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. First though, a quick thing on just the general situation of stuff. So if you'd like to help us keep on making content like this, where we're now seeing our 20 plus hours of work for a video like this and at about $150, which is obviously at a loss, Patreon is the place. Over there, you help our team do these full in-depth looks, and you also get a bunch of cool physical loot and other things. You get that loot in the mail if you want, and if you're into classes, I mean, hey, this month's pre-order for the pins is actually Priest. It's a really, really nice design. So yeah, seriously, patrons, you're making this possible. Everyone thanks you for it. And with that, let's get into the Death Knight. So, as always, let's start with the general things. What have they got? Well, Death and Decay, Death Coil, Raise Dead, Anti-Magic Zone, and Chains of Ice are now shared across every single spec. That in itself is actually quite exciting. Then Lichborn is back with an extra 10% leash, and yes, some quick cast Death Coils is a pretty substantial heal. Death Pact is actually still in the talent tree, but the old Death Pact has been brought back via Sacrificial Pact. Your summoned ghoul can be exploded to deal damage and heal for 25% HP. Death Knights are also getting some actually really nice new runes to forge into their weapons. There's Hysteria, Sanguination, Spell Warding, Apocalypse, and Unending Thirst. Hysteria actually increases the runic power cap and it gives you windows of increased generation. Then Sanguination gives you a huge heal when you fall below 35% HP, and it increases Death Strike's damage based on the target's missing HP. Then Spell Warding, well, that reduces spell damage taken and gives a magic damage shield that slows cast speed when hit. Apocalypse gives your ghouls the chance to afflict various debuffs, and Unending Thirst gives haste, move speed, and some healing on your kills. There's actually some really good stuff there, I think. They might not be used all the time, but I think that the inclusion of those new runes and just generally the broader things that all of the DKs have, that does fit Blizzard's philosophy for classes, right? Give players the tools and then let them find some cool possible uses for them. So overall, this stuff is great for Death Knights. Death Knights will, they will be a lot harder to kill now, right, with their new options. You've got Anti-Magic Zone, that's going to be great raid utility, and then the runes might give you more options than just Fallen Crusader. Every DK running a 15% strength proc was a little bit grim, especially when it decided not to line up with cooldown usage. So, overall here, positive changes, stuff to actually be pretty excited about. But with the general stuff covered, it's of course time for us to hop into the specs themselves. One of the most requested features is back for Frost. You can dual wield one-handers if you want, or you can use a single two-handed weapon. Now this should be mostly inconsequential and down to player choice and gear drops, but there are some concerns here, right? Frost relies on auto attacks, okay, quite a bit for what it does. And that's via Killing Machine, which operates on the crits of your auto attacks, which, well, they're going to be a lot less frequent when you're using a slower swing speed. Now, Blizzard's RPPM system should pretty much make it so that it's overall, like, across the course of a fight, the same on average, but yeah, you're going to have less frequent chances to proc that stuff, which will result in it feeling a little bit less smooth. So there will be a gameplay sort of pace implication there. Now, that's not too much of a crime, but that also applies to Runic Attenuation, which is a very popular talent, which could get a little bit awkward. The biggest problem with moving to two-handed, though, is the loss of one rune. with all the new runes, two-handed might actually feel a bit left out there, and it doesn't really gain anything in exchange. Now, in the theoretical example of a Breath of Sindragosa build that uses Hysteria and another rune, well, that could have some balancing quirks, I suppose. So hopefully this is something that Blizzard can actually just keep from being a perception problem, because if it's, say, accepted that dual-wielding 1H is stronger, then two-handed Frost players may be seen as being bad, which is of course not what we want to have happen. Now, there is a potential for a fix here via, legendary effects, or just strong weapons that are specifically designed, or Blizzard just doing behind-the-scenes number balancing. Maybe, like a two-handed weapon from a certain boss could be base for Frost via some sort of Frost damage effect. That could be a really cool goal for people to aim for in a raid tier, so they could cycle it, right? So that people maybe swap based on, loot drops, right? What they're actually doing there. And of course, without Titan Forging, it's way easier for Blizzard to design a rewarding sort of, loop there. Then moving on to some other additions, Frost get Frostworm's Fury baseline. I mean, it was barely a choice to begin with, so that's definitely a nice thing to have. Now, in its place is a talent called Hypothermic Presence, and this reduces runic power costs for 8 seconds every 45 seconds. It is specifically off the global cooldown. Even the tooltip says so. So that's pretty cool. That's a good ability, but it synergizes maybe too well with Breath of Sindragosa and exacerbates a core problem with runic power that we're going to talk about in this video in a bit. So overall for Frost, look, there's not massive changes to the core, but there are a few small things. So one core change that should stop any weird scaling is that Killing Machine gives Obliterate Frost damage, and this means that Mastery doesn't leave it feeling weaker over time. So that's pretty cool. There's also no returning Azerite traits because, well, they weren't super interesting, although the loss of Icy Citadel and Frostwhelp's Indignation, that could be felt by players. Like we've seen with many specs, though, there's really nothing super exciting here, but a bit of a rebalance and then some borrowed power could make this all feel quite good once you actually get into it through this expansion. And of course, having Frostworms and getting to use your two-hander, that is pretty cool. But I suppose I would say that there are times that this just feels like one of the specs that sort of had fundamental issues that were covered up by systems rather than having a very solid core. I mean, having to use talent slots to get AoE spenders, yeah, that doesn't really feel great, especially when Glacial Advance isn't even very good. That relationship as well between runic power and runes feels a little bit wrong, at least in my experience. Without running breath, runic power feels like it's something you have to spend instead of something you want to spend. So maybe there's just some tuning there that can make that feel better. Glacial Advance and Frost Strike don't feel great, and even with Obliteration, their only purpose is to dump runic power in the hopes of getting some runes back. Kind of mirrors a little bit of frustration with the Enhancement Shaman. I don't think to as much of a degree, but where the secondary resource just feels a little bit frustrating more than it feels good to use. So there is that going on. Now, there's also talents. There's a little bit of an imbalance there. Ice Cap, I think, needs to be buffed from a 1 second cooldown reduction to 4, and even then it still might not compete with Breath, which is even stronger, of course, thanks to Hypothermic Presence and Rune of Hysteria. Now, Obliteration is as uninteresting as always too. It adds a good rhythm, but I think it's just a little bit underwhelming sometimes. I think it should probably be made baseline so that runic power feels like it's got a bit more purpose. Realistically, I just think a deeper look at this spec is needed so that Breath doesn't feel like it's the only interesting thing that you can be doing with your Frost Death Knight. But that said, for the majority of players, it is really quite satisfying indeed. So yeah, I personally think Blizzard have, they've nailed how good it is to smash a Killing Machine Obliterate into a single target. So doing that, dropping a Frostworm at the end of a huge Pillar of Frost to wipe out a full group of mobs, that stuff feels fantastic. It's just that for me, there are a few small frustrations that do add up with the spec. Now, I do have one quick suggestion that wouldn't fundamentally change the spec, but could make it a bit more fun. I would say maybe try letting Killing Machine stack a few times, and then move Obliteration to baseline, and then change it so that Frost Strike crits proc it instead of every Frost Strike. Then move Frost Strike to the same half of the global cooldown that Wild Strike used to be on, so the dumping, dumping RP via Frost Strike feels like this really fast, aggressive increase in pace. I think that could be really cool, right? You could dump Frost Strikes faster, and it could sort of feel like a bit of a combo, rapidly building you into a series of Obliterate crits. So yeah, that could be really fast-paced and fun, and it absolutely would fit the Gatling gun style fantasy of dual wielding a bit more than it would fit two-handed, but hey, that's just a start, that's just an idea. I'd love to know what you think, though, what could be added to Frost to make it a little bit more spicy, but with that, let's go talk about Unholy. Alright, so Unholy, it is a solid spec, and I think it has been for a while. It saw a lot of use in Battle for Azeroth thanks to some particular strengths, but I mean a lot of that was because it was really fun to play in AoE when Frost wasn't. Now, in terms of things, it's got Summon Gargoyle baseline, and Army of the Damned now summons a Magus with you. That rolls in an Azerite trait into that talent. Then pet damage also scales with Mastery, which will help to keep the spec just feel a bit more smooth as the expansion goes on with the scaling. Beyond that, there's not really a whole lot though. I mean, Summon Gargoyle's empty spot, that's Unholy Pact now, which is kind of boring. It's the Hell Chains Azerite trait basically, but buffed, adding Flaming Chains and 8% strength during Dark Transformation. Pretty boring really, but it's clearly designed to be the simple option. And I think while leaving Festermite in Battle for Azeroth might be good for the health of the game, given how dominant it was, it is going to feel pretty terrible for Unholy DKs moving into this expansion not having that. So hopefully that gameplay does make a return in some form for the people who miss it, or at least, that there's something equally as satisfying going on there. So yeah, I mean, nothing here has really changed. Having Summon Gargoyle and Unholy Frenzy together, that will allow for some really big Gargoyle uses, and that is going to feel really cool. Unholy was, I think, in a good spot before BFA, so leaving it largely untouched at the core does make sense, but there are some pain points that could really be addressed as we move into this expansion. Like with Frost, I think spending runic power doesn't feel that good, and then using it as a little bit of an afterthought and, sudden doom procs to grant free casts, I think that actually makes it feel a little bit worse. Again, just mirroring those issues of the Enhancement Shaman, where it just had that feeling where Maelstrom was actually more of a burden than it was a fun resource to spend. So there's that going on there. I mean, Epidemic, that's your only AoE runic power spender. Kind of like with Frost's Glacial Advance. Obviously it feels better than Glacial Advance, but it's still a talent, and that leaves the spec feeling just a bit incomplete without picking it. In all honesty, having to keep the talent system with 7 rows and 3 choices in each row, it is starting to look like it's just holding some of the spec's tools at ransom a little bit, rather than actually making them be choices. I wonder if it's time for Blizzard to just evaluate if talents are actually doing what they want them to do, or maybe if they need to change a little bit of how they handle talents going forward. I mean, for Unholy, Epidemic should probably be baseline, right? I mean, in this case, I know this is something I've railed against in the past, but even if it's literally just that you get Epidemic baseline and then a talent that buffs Epidemic, it's just that without Epidemic baseline, it feels like there's a hole in the kit. Sort of. So there you go. I mean, there's that as a little bit of a quibble, but overall I do think that Unholy is a pretty fantastic spec that does feel great to play. Building and popping your wounds, especially with Apocalypse, that's just really fun, right? The fantasy's really cool, and that is something that is intact in this next expansion. And I mean, hell, the overall thing is elevated. You get your Gargoyle, and you get, your anti-magic zone and all of your stuff that's been baselined, right? So it is definitely a win for both DKs. I think they could do a little bit more, go a bit further with trying to spice it up, but who knows? Maybe Blizzard are going to do that, but it's going to be in the form of, say, the legendaries that we're getting via Torghast, or maybe the Covenant Soulbinds or something like that. Anyway, there you go. That is Unholy. So there you have it, DKs. It's, it's an interesting situation, definitely. Unholy is just a pretty cool spec. I think having all these new runes is really great, even just for the theme. And generally, man, just having having all of that baselining stuff coming in, I think that really just does wonders for the feel. So I'm pretty much I'm down with all that stuff, pretty sweet. The only thing for me is just, can we make runic power feel a little bit better in Frost? Is it possible to just add a little bit more complexity to Frost? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but even if there was a talent that replaced Frost Strike with the version of Frost Strike that we talked about in this video, I just feel like it's such a cool theme of a spec, and the basics of hitting those buttons, come on, whenever you do that obliteration after the killing machine, and it feels so cool, doesn't it? I just feel like some of the mechanics there could just be notched up just a little bit. That said, both specs benefit so much from all of the baselining, the baselining across from the class to the specs, that's really good. And then both, having your Gargoyle and your Frostworm, that's also pretty nice. So it's that real thing with Shadowlands where even the classes who are not necessarily winning big, or the specs who are not necessarily winning big on their spec-specific changes, what we are seeing is just generally, stuff's better because you've got more buttons, right? You've got more utility. And I think in the hands of creative players, that can lead to, more engaging classes where you feel like there's just more stuff you can do. So pretty exciting stuff. I'd love to know though, what do you think think, right? So Death Knights, do let me know. Thank you for watching today's video, and with that, I'll see you next time.